Thank you for coming. Thank you so much. You're at a show called Curacaos, which what we do is bring on once a month, right here, the first Tuesday of every month, we bring on local luminaries from San Diego and Tijuana who are enriching the region, have an inspiring, interesting perspective of some kind to hear what they have to say. The reason we do this is for two reasons. The first is there's this kind of idea that San Diego has very little cultural activity or diversity. You know, like most people think of San Diego, they think of like SeaWorld and tacos and good weather, and that's fine. Those are great things. Maybe not SeaWorld, but the rest of them are nice.
Tacos are good things, though.
Tacos are great things. I love tacos and burritos and all that. But to keep perpetuating this idea that San Diego has incredible diversity and incredibly diverse communities and incredible creativity, and to keep perpetuating like this idea that doesn't, kind of relegates to the background some important voices that if we could more openly promote and engage with would just make the city even more powerful. Just some fun facts about San Diego. We have the most resettled refugees of anywhere in the country. We have the most small farms per capita of anywhere in the country. We have the first state-recognized cultural districts in Barrio Logan and Balboa Park. The most cross-border in the world between us and Mexico. So I could keep saying all these things, but the point is that there's incredibly diverse communities and incredible diverse people and ideas and creativity, and I just hope that we can all engage with it more fully. That's why we try to do this. The second is to kind of promote the reality that we live in a binational region with the most cross-border in the world between us. There's a huge fluidity of people and ideas every day, and I think the more that each side can connect to the other side and is encouraged to connect to the other side, the more not only do we become a more resilient region in the face of globalization, but it's also just a nice antidote to nationalism and xenophobia that happens everywhere else. So here we are. Anyways, which brings me to my first guest, who like I said, I met here at Tiger, Mr. Lieutenant Benjamin Kelso, Mr. Lieutenant Benjamin Kelso, who obviously right now we live in a very revealing and potent time where a lot of realities that haven't been spoken about for many years are being exposed. One of those, the reason we're here today, is the police mistreatment of Black and brown people and minority communities across America. Just the mistreatment, a disproportionate amount of incarceration that is now well documented. But the reality is obviously more complex than that, and we get to hear a lot about, we get to hear the voices of people who have been at the receiving end of the mistreatment, and we've also gotten to hear from the police, but we don't often get to hear from someone who can speak to both. And I think that's a very worthwhile and inspiring and just important perspective to hear, having these. I was just talking to someone before the event started about, like, we need more opportunities to have public discourse and open dialogue instead of people going at each other's throat. Things are not so black and white. They're not, like, it's very easy to make them black and white, but there's more nuance to the story, and I hope by having Mr. Kelso here join us, we can all expand our understanding and just learn a little bit, talk to each other, get to know one another, and yeah, that's what it is. So all that aside, before we give a hand to Mr. Kelso, this is a very impressive human being. Even without his gun, he can probably kick all our butts. He's a 5th degree black belt. Yeah, don't mess with him. He's an actor, a father, just an all-around impressive dude. So, with no further ado, please give it up for Mr. Ben Kelso. And the gold pick.
Not real gold.
Still looks badass.
Anyways, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Just get a heckler already.
That's all right. He's in the front row.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I have to remind you before I start asking questions that this, at any point in the conversation, if you have a burning question, you can raise your hand, like school. Go back to school, and I'll call on you. You don't have to remember your question, because that's happened to me a lot when I go to an event and and then I have a question, and then you have to wait till the end for the Q&A, and by the time the Q&A comes, just you forgot. So, just raise your hand, and I'll call on you. Cool.
Will we have commercial breaks?
We can have some beer breaks. No, we won't have any breaks unless someone really, unless you have to go to the bathroom.
We got truffle fries though.
Truffle fry break.
Yeah. Something you said earlier though, does San Diego really have more farms than, I'm thinking rural Kentucky and then, Idaho. I don't know. I've never been to Idaho.
But you're surprised that's why we have our drought so bad.
Really?
Yeah.
That was really interesting. See,
it's the truth. I was surprised too, but we have there. I mean, you think the Midwest, but it's most small farms. I don't know how they classify the scale, but it's the most small farms per capita in the nation. Like urban farming, backyard farming, and in Fallbrook there's thousands of avocado farms and dairy. But yeah, it's true.
We also have the most microbreweries.
The most microbrewery. There is a lot of beer here.
It's good to be known for that.
Yeah, that's not a bad thing.
The most in the United States, and then San Diego's the most in California.
San Diego's doing big things. Anyways, so I'm gonna start at the beginning and just kind of give you start easy and simple to get to know who you are.
Okay.
Are you from San Diego?
I am not.
Where are you from?
I am originally from a place called Flint, Michigan, which has become famous recently in a not so good way. I'm sure you're all aware that Flint has a water crisis issue that in a nutshell, some people made the decision to stop getting water from Lake Erie on the Great Lakes and have it piped down to Flint, Michigan, which is a city right outside of Detroit, about 60 miles north of Detroit. It was the heart and soul of General Motors, and I know you hear that when you think General Motors, you think Detroit, and that's where the corporate offices were, all right? But Flint, Michigan is where the cars and trucks were being made. And not only were the cars and trucks being made there, but the spark plugs and the wires and the radios and the lug nuts and the tires and everything that went along with producing vehicles was made in Flint, Michigan. And when General Motors, basically when they packed up and moved out and a lot of those jobs went to Mexico and other places, the folks that really depended on their livelihood there, they lost it, all right? And someone in Michigan, and you'd have to look it up yourself to find out who really did it, made the decision that they would start using the Flint River as the water source, all right? And that wasn't a good thing. So I originally grew up in Flint and went to high school in Flint and then moved to Detroit the second part of my high school experience, and then left there to go play college basketball for a year in Ohio. I'm from Michigan. I know I saw Ohio State in here somewhere.
Back here!
Oh. I said the name. Now, when I really get into it, I won't even say the name. I'll just say that place down south, right? And they'll refer to that place up north, all right? They fought a war, Michigan and Ohio, all right? Does anybody look it up? You got Google. Look it up on your phone. It's called the Toledo War. It was over access to the Great Lakes. Michigan originally owned all of the Great Lakes on both sides, and they controlled all the shipping in and out of the area. And in order to be admitted to the Union, we know what the Union is, right? The U.S. In order to be admitted to the Union, had to give up some of that territory, all right? And then Indiana and Illinois and Ohio got access to the Great Lakes. And Toledo, Ohio was originally in Michigan.
That's unfortunate.
Hold you back.
Yeah. That's okay. That's all right. We meet on the last Saturday in November every year. And we know what happens that day.
Yeah, we do.
I know.
Who holds the record?
And they have beaten us quite a bit over the last decade or so. We still have won more than them. That place down south. Right. But they won this year, and yeah, it was a very disappointing Saturday. And last year.
What was that last?
And the year before that.
Oh, my
All right. We don't want to fight to break on. We have other things to talk about. So, I'm curious what inspired you when you were a kid. Was there a family member that had a big influence on you growing up that inspired you to become a police officer?
Well, it wasn't a family member, but there was an individual that inspired me to want to be a police officer. Originally, being from Flint, Michigan, and playing sports, and like I said, I played a year of college basketball. I thought I was going to be a professional athlete, like most inner city urban kids who play sports. That's kind of your goal. But for me, it was even bigger because my father was a professional basketball player. So naturally, you know, I kind of aspired to do those things, and I got an injury my first year, my freshman year, and you know, coming back from an injury back in 1985, 86, you know, it's not the same today. I think you can hurt your knee and they'll give you surgery in the locker room and you'll be playing in 2 weeks, but it wasn't like that back when I got injured. And my heart wasn't into it anymore, so I decided I wanted to do something else. And I wound up coming out here to California, believing that I could go to college out here because it was only $3 a unit, right? And at the time, I know, right? $3 a unit. Everybody here should have a degree, right?
Remember when it was $3 a gallon?
Oh, and woo.
It's like $100 for a degree.
I know. But so I came out here and I went to Palomar College and I was gonna play basketball there, and one thing led to another, and I started hanging out with a couple of guys at the 24-Hour Fitness up in North Escondido, and it wasn't called 24-Hour Fitness back then, it was called Family Fitness, right? I was working out there and a couple of officers came in and we made friends, and they took me on a ride along, and you know, we drove really fast and did exciting things, and you know, here I am. I know there was more to it than that. When I was growing up, there was a Flint police officer. And have any of you watched Flint Town on Netflix?
Yeah.
Oh man, it's visceral. You really got to check it out. That city has been decimated with the loss of General Motors, all the way down to even public safety, police and fire. And that story of the water crisis and the impact it had on the area is told from the eyes of the Flint Police Department. So if you get a chance, and you know, they're not paying me to say that, all right, but check it out. There was a Flint police officer who worked in the. When my parents divorced when I was 5 years old, and I lived with both parents over the course of my childhood. I had a few years with my mother and a few years with my father, but their lifestyles were uniquely different. And my mom lived in a housing complex, the projects. That's what we I don't think they use that term today, right? But basically, the projects is is a poor neighborhood, right? Apartment living, very poor, and there was an officer that worked our area. His name was Officer Jimmy Edwards, right? And that officer was out there when I was a kid. He was out there coaching football, teaching the kids, and he was always around, and I'm gonna say I got in trouble, when I was a young man, like most kids, but you knew that Officer Edwards knew you, knew everybody in your family. He knew where to find you. It wasn't like you were gonna hide from him. So when Officer Edwards came up, you don't run from him, because I know you. I know where you live, I know your mom, I know your grandmother, your cousin, your aunts, I know everybody in your family, so they're gonna drag you out to me, so you might as well not run, right? Which is true, all right? We go to my grandmother's house, and if people got in trouble, my grandmother would drag them outside, and they would take care of business. But anyway, Officer Edwards was kind of the vision of a traditional community police officer. He understood us, he was there with us, we saw him every day, we spoke to him, whether we were having a good day or a bad day, he was always there no matter what. And that weighed on me, and when I met those officers out in San Diego, and they were San Diego police officers, and they said, well, you could do this job. And what's funny is I never thought I wanted to be a police officer. Never thought it was going to be the type of thing I wanted. Like I said, I thought I was going to be a college basketball player. And then I thought about I want to be a lawyer. And I want to be all these lofty things, right? But I needed a job. You know, being a poor college student, even though, you know, college was only $3 a unit in California, right? You still got to pay rent, right? And I wanted to buy a nice car and not drive a Toyota Tercel that was busted, you know. Wanted to live a little bit nicer. So I applied, I got the job, got hired, and the impact of Officer Edwards came to me as I was developing as a young police officer, right? That the model that I had for what a police officer was Jimmy Edwards, right? And I didn't see Jimmy Edwards do the stuff that you see on TV. I didn't see him running, chasing people, and tackling people, fighting people. Jimmy Edwards was just kind of a nice guy, right? You know, and you know, he talked to us every day, and you know, I said, well, if I'm gonna be like anybody, I want it to be like him, right? And that's what I kind of modeled myself after, and that drew me to other officers in my young career that modeled the sorts of ideals that Jimmy Edwards did also. And one of them is actually here. He's sitting in the corner over here. You know, when I was 23, 24 years old, all right, and I had a supervisor, all right, this young man over here was that guy who taught me that I didn't know everything that I thought I did, right? I wasn't as smart as I thought I was, right? And he's the boss, and I better listen to him or I could get fired, right?
So he's raising you a humble man.
But he's right here. Michael Cash, right over here. Woo! Oh yes, give it up for Michael Cash, people. I give it up for Michael Cash. I tell you every day, every time. Hey, you really invested in me, all right, when I was brand new, and I really appreciate that.
It seems like you grew up in an environment, in a location where like the police still represented security, and like there was a trust, there was inherent trust between the community.
There was a trust between some officers and not trust of other officers. I did not grow up trusting all officers. I grew up trusting one officer, and that was enough.
That was enough.
That was enough.
Because a lot of friends that I grew up with, and I lived in New York for a while, like they never had that one trust, that one connection that made them believe that there was any good in the police. Yeah. They only grew up in the projects of Brooklyn, where like they had very bad experiences.
I've been to Brooklyn. It's really nice now.
Yeah, no, it's changed. It's changed a lot. But did you ever experience anything that, like for example, these friends that I had in Brooklyn? I can't imagine them with the experiences that they told me about having them been too happy about any family members of theirs joining the police. It would have been like in their young minds, like someone joining the other side, right? Like because they had experienced such negative treatment from the police that they, at least in Brooklyn, like they wouldn't have been too happy about any family members. Did you experience any backlash when you decided to become a police officer?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it started with the friends that I had at the time. Growing up where I grew up and the relationship that we had with the police, like I said, I only trusted one officer, right? The other officers we didn't trust, we ran from them, right? And you know, it was deeply ingrained in the culture, the inner city culture, especially in communities of color, to distrust the police, not like the police. And that goes all the way through my family to even my parents, right? And when I told my friends, you know, because being a police officer is a transition. You don't just go down, take the test, apply, and get the job. There's kind of a lifestyle that you have to lead before you get the job. And part of that is, you know, not getting in trouble. You know, they check your credit, you gotta pay your bills on time. You know, they check your driving record, you can't be going out getting tickets and all those things. All that stuff matters. So a person who's thinking about being a police officer, even though they say the background process today, oh, we can get it done in 90 days. No, back when I went through, and this was in the late 80s, it took about a solid year, you know, to go from start to finish, right? And during that year, I had to cut loose a lot of people that were doing things back in the neighborhood that I grew up with. These were lifelong friends, right? But you know, some of them, they you know, America has a new appreciation now of cannabis that back in that time was not as appreciated. All right, so I had to cut loose all of those people because that was one of the questions they asked you in the background is, well, you know, they offer you these scenario questions. Hey, you're at a party and yeah, you know, one of your friends is smoking weed. He offers you some. What do you do? You know, or
What do you do?
now I go, man, I didn't know you smoke weed. You know, I go, do you have a card for that? You got a prescription? Right, you know. But they ask you a lot of questions like that. So you learn if you want to, because one person in the process can arbitrarily remove you from the process. Right? At any one point, there's several steps. It's a layered process to get through. And one person could remove you just because they didn't like, you know, they didn't like how you dressed that day. It could be that arbitrary. They didn't like your hairstyle. You know, you had to be clean shaven. You had to fit a mold. Police officers, I mean, and when you think about it today, when you see officers in uniform, you'll notice there's a lot of similarities to them, you know, the way their hair is cut and the way they stand, and you know, I know what police officers, even though they're not wearing a uniform, I know what they look like, right? There's just a way about them. I recognize it and they recognize me, right? So, you know, you have to cut people out of your life. But when I got a job offer and it became serious, I had to tell my parents. And both my parents were very disapproving of me making this career choice. And in fact, my father, who is the individual who's probably most influential on me, right? He actually said, you know, you shouldn't take that job. You know, he said, you should find something else to do. He said, let someone else's son go be a police officer, right? Because my father is very, even today, and my daughters are here, and when we go to Grandpa's house, Grandpa still has a lot of negative things to say about police officers. I just ignore him now because, you know, he's 73 years old, and I just say, man, sit down. You know, I'm like, you know, oh, police officers, they do all that. I'm like, okay. All right, they stopped me. Oh, what'd you do, coach? You know, I call him coach. He's a basketball coach. He was a professional basketball player. What'd you do, coach? Well, I was, you know, whatever, and he ran a light or whatever, but I'm like, coach, didn't you just say you just ran a light, man? They're supposed to stop you because you did something, right? I'm fighting it. All right, coach, go ahead, fight it. You know, but he said he didn't want me to be a police officer. And what's funny is over time, if anything happens in law enforcement, any major incidents on the news, the first person who calls me, all right, before I have that conversation with anybody in the community or at home, I gotta have that conversation with my father over the phone, right? And you know, they're always interesting conversations, but one thing I appreciate is that he says, I don't like policemen, but you're my son, I like you. All right, good. That's a concession for me.
It's very. We hear a lot about obviously the systemic racism that in communities like. I'm gonna ask you about this later in San Diego, but obviously in like Chicago and New York and the South, how disproportionately communities of minorities are treated from not in the police. Did you experience any getting into the police? Did you experience any racism or any kind of any of that dynamic going into the force?
You know, I think coming in, if I did, I wouldn't have recognized it because I didn't know what to expect coming into the job. But I was very cognizant because I think people of color generally are very cognizant of and sensitive to issues of race and racism, right? So you know, it's kind of like your antennas are always up. You're looking for it because you kind of have to adjust to it as a daily sort of thing that you deal with, right? And even when we start talking about, you know, issues of systemic racism and those sorts of things, that people of color kind of, I mean, I think you're born into just having to accept that racism is something you deal with every day. So coming onto the police department, it's no different, right? No different. I expected that there were going to be people who either judged me or treated me differently or whatever, right? Based on my mind, because of skin color. And they worked with me, right? And I'm not saying that that's necessarily the case, but that's what my feeling was, especially early on in my career. And there were incidents that happened to me in my youth as a young officer that, you know, I perceived as potentially being racial, you know, having some sort of racial undertone. I grew up in Michigan, right? It's a General Motors area. Where I came from, no one drove foreign cars. There wasn't a Toyota driving down your street in Michigan because everybody made Buicks and Cadillacs and Chevrolets. And in fact, if you had a BMW, you know, people were upset and they probably scratched it and ruined it and did all kinds of things to it because that was somebody's job, right? So when I got here, I had only been out of Michigan. I got hired in 1989, started the academy early 1990. I had only been here 3 years, right? And I spent all my time up in North County because that's where I moved. I didn't know much of the city then, and I drove a Cadillac, right? Because everywhere where I come from, that's the car to have. You know, here it's probably a BMW or a Mercedes or something fancy like that, or a Prius, right? It's North Park, right? But in Michigan, you drove a Buick, you drove a Cadillac, right? You didn't drive a Honda, a Nissan, anything, right? And when I got here, all right, not only did I have a Cadillac, but I have a big Cadillac, a big blue Cadillac. My daughters don't even remember that. And I was an athlete, so athletes wear athletic clothes, right? My father was a basketball coach. We always wore sweatsuits. So I was driving a blue Cadillac, wearing a blue sweatsuit, going down Imperial Avenue, hey, right? Even though I just left, I know, hey, right? Yeah, just having left Southeastern Division, you know, in like 1990, right? And I got pulled over, right, by my coworkers, right? And when they pulled me over, I was like, whoa, what am I getting stopped for? Because I wasn't speeding. I'm like, oh, what's going on? Or at least I didn't think I was. I didn't think I did anything wrong. And when they saw me, when they walked up, they immediately recognized who I was. So I said, you know, hey, guys, I'm not going to mention their names, but I said, well, what'd you stop me for? He said, I thought you were a Crip. Right? Now, understanding what that meant is, well, you were driving a blue car, wearing a blue sweatsuit, you know, a black guy driving a blue car, blue sweatsuit, in an area where people don't wear blue sweatsuits, because that weighed into the stop also, right? They stopped me. And after that, it was like, oh, thought you were a Crip? Oh, okay, all right. And I went home and that was the end of it, right? But I processed that. What did that mean, right? As a police officer at the time, that meant, well, okay, I gotta be cognizant of what color clothes I wear, you know, because I didn't know gang areas and that sort of thing at that time, because I hadn't been in San Diego long enough, and I wasn't educated on San Diego's gang culture. In Flint, Michigan, I knew what the gang culture was, right? But I didn't know San Diego, right? And basically, I was in a blood area, wearing blue clothes, driving a blue car. Could make myself a potential victim of crime. So, you know, there's some duality there, right?
Yeah, how do you, I'm so curious how you reconcile that duality of like when you see something like, I don't know, like the Trayvon Martin story or Ferguson or all these things that have been coming out in the last few years.
Very tragic stories, by the way.
Yeah, incredibly tragic stories, but there's, what I'm trying to say is there's very real suffering at the hands of the police in black communities and brown communities. There's very real pain, and people are pissed, you know, and there's very famous hip hop songs that speak very not nicely of the police.
I played them going to the academy. That was unique too, right? And then people were looking at me funny. I'm like, it's just a song.
Yeah, but exactly, it's just a song. But to a lot of police officers who are not black, they can't. I would assume they take it offensively. But you can kind of identify, like
They did.
there is real racism that happens from the police towards minority communities, but at the same time, like, there's more nuance to the story. There's obviously good policemen and there's black policemen. So what goes through your mind in these last few years when there's such a polarization between black communities and the police, and you're both?
You know, it's really interesting trying to walk in both of those worlds, because there are people who believe that you have to make a choice. You have to decide, you know, as a black police officer, you know, you have to be blue. And there are individuals that will subscribe to that and say, hey, we're all one thing, we're all blue, you're with us. And then there's people in the black community that say, well, you're black, you can't be blue, you're always going to be black. And the funny thing about that is that, well, I understand that I'm a black man and I'm always going to be a black man. I'm a black man first, but I'm also a police officer, right? And I have a job to do, and I believe in doing my job with dignity, ethically, you know, treating people ethically, all right? And understanding that I have some cultural sensitivity that sometimes gives me a greater influence over people in communities where they look like me, right? And the unfortunate part of that is you can't really make anybody happy, right? Because you can be doing the best job you can, but somebody's always going to say either you're not blue enough or you're not black enough, right? And then you ask, well, what does that mean, right? And basically what it means is that you have to side with me on everything on one side, or you have to side with me on and that's not how it really works. You know, I side with the law. The law is what it is. Police officers are governed by the law, right? That's what gives officers their power to do anything. And you know, I go by the law. If the law says you can't cross the street between traffic signals outside a crosswalk, that's what the law says. I didn't make that law. My job is to enforce that law. How I enforce the law matters, right? I believe in enforcing the law fairly, but the bigger thing is to do it with dignity, grace, and compassion. And not everybody does that, right? There's no rule that says you have to enforce the law that way, right? So what we have is officers that sometimes enforce the law righteously because you know they did witness a person violating the law, but their delivery of enforcement, the sensitivity doesn't come out, all right? And that's when these situations kind of spiral out of control.
Right, because... Go ahead.
On the topic of like police brutality and like things like that happening, say like Ferguson or anything, did you happen to know that like Native Americans get like tortured by cops and stuff, and pulled over and messed with, and have been killed by cops more than African Americans?
That wouldn't surprise me.
At a higher rate. The only reason that it's just lower numbers. There's
Sure.
lower numbers of us that exist, so they like people don't really
Like per capita, there's more.
Yeah, they don't
Right.
really recognize it, but there's like women getting shot by cops. There's like, you know, I mean, in all Native American communities and stuff. And I feel like that's something that like, does that like,
I'll repeat what he said.
Is that a topic in like, you know what I mean, like within cops? Like you guys talk about that, like.
Can I just ask you in the microphone, because some people didn't hear, and then it can be recorded.
If you're asking San Diego Police Department, if you're saying specifically, do we talk about issues that relate to Native American communities and things like that? We don't. Just because I don't think San Diego has a very large Native American community, you know, particularly in the 4th District, you know, or here in the 9th District. That I personally have never actually seen a community built around a Native American demographic here in San Diego. Do they have those?
Yeah, that's where I'm from. My family's here.
All right. What part of town?
It's by the casinos.
Okay.
Paula, like Paula.
East, yeah.
Okay.
So it's
All right.
not really like San Diego, but it's like San Diego County. But like we're all the way from like Riverside all the way to Mexico. It's like Decennial and a lot of. You can look up a map like before like our Christopher Columbus's map and art, and it's like it shows like everything.
That's probably a topic of a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
You could be up here.
We'll have to do that another time. No, but I want to touch on what before I let you go. He touched on it a little bit too. But you were saying how you try to enforce the law with compassion and dignity, but that doesn't always happen, right? Like the law governs the police, but what do you think about what goes through your mind when a police, someone like George Zimmerman or something like that, like clearly abuses his power and then gets away with it, and there's obviously a lot of forces at play there. I wonder like what you think about it, and do you talk about it with your fellow police officers, or how do we regulate that and ensure that is not happening?
Every major incident that shows up on the news or on social media that involves law enforcement gets discussed among law enforcement. Police officers talk about everything, and believe it or not, they have as diverse opinions about these issues as anyone else does, right? George Zimmerman was not a police officer, by the way.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't get that. He was a private citizen.
Yeah.
He was not a law enforcement officer.
He was a citizen.
There you go. And that story, I mean, the Deep South is uniquely different from San Diego, all right? And I will tell you that when I grew up, even in Michigan, all right, when I was spoken to as a young man by white men, all right, I usually didn't have a name. I was called boy. They called you boy all the time. Come here, boy. Boy, where's your father? Right? And being a young black man, being called boy, I received boy as an insult, as a term that meant I was insignificant. And in the Deep South today, that term is still used. They still refer to people as boy. They still have, racism is deeply entrenched in the Deep South, but the difference between there and here is in the Deep South, it's open.
That's true.
It's open. You can go into a restaurant and there's two lines. There's a line for white people and a line for not white people. And if you are in the wrong line in the Deep South, they will kindly tell you you're in the wrong line or not serve you. Still today. Still today. All right? Because that's the culture of that area. We really like to believe that racism and discrimination, those things aren't a factor in the modern society in America, but that's really not the case. That's television, and that's the lens you have in your local area. I won't talk about the president, not in uniform.
I'll call you right after. We have a question up here and then back there.
There's, I guess, two-part question. Well, the first one is, even though this is in the Deep South,
and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but aside from the most farms per capita, we also are known to have the biggest amount of white supremacy groups per capita in San Diego County. That's just like a fact that I've heard many times, but the question that I was getting to was, what happens when there is a law that you might not agree with, because whether it's for your own personal values or for whatever reason, like as an example, El Cajon has been getting a lot of this, media lately. For one of the things was they arrested a couple people for feeding homeless people, and they used the law as their reasoning for it. So like when there's, of course, being a police officer, it's a very tricky situation making a judgment call. When there's something that you don't agree with personally, but the law is telling you you have to ticket this person or you have to arrest this person because that is what the law says, how do you respond to that?
Police officers are given a lot of discretion in terms of the enforcement action they take. And sometimes it's not the law so much that dictates an arrest, but it's the policy of the agency, the department policy, right? Because you're given the discretion to decide. First of all, there's a lot of tricky rules. I can't give you a class in 5 minutes on how it all works, but there's either infractions misdemeanors, or felonies, right? And officers have discretion on infractions and misdemeanors. In fact, they have to occur in the officer's presence for the officer to even make an arrest. Or a citizen can make an arrest if it occurred in their presence, right? You can't tell me, you know, let's say he stole your wallet, right? Well, stealing your wallet could be a grand theft, but let's say he stole your pen, right? If you didn't see him steal your pen and you got nothing that can prove that he didn't just find the pen, that he intentionally took the pen, I can decide that, you know, because that's a misdemeanor or an infraction, I can decide that I don't really want to enforce that, right? But department policy may dictate something different, right? And in El Cajon, there's always going to be bad law, right? But the officers don't create those laws, right? The people actually create those laws. The legislative branch of wherever creates those laws. And when we discover a bad law, it's usually because people have been arrested for that bad law, right? And they've gone through court, and the tenor of the community changes, and then they decide they need to change that law, right? I don't have the availability in some circumstances to decide whether or not I can arrest or not arrest. There are some policies that say I must arrest, all right? And then there's others that give me the discretion. So in my career, there's lots of laws out there I didn't always agree with, right? And if I had the opportunity to use discretion and it was appropriate to use discretion, I used it. There are other times where I could have used discretion, but it wasn't the appropriate thing to do. Maybe the person needed to go to jail, right? And that's kind of how I based my decisions. I didn't always make them off, well, do I like the law or not? That wasn't really a factor in it. It was more of, is the arrest the right thing to do to solve the problem today? Because that's how police officers think, right? There's a lot of things they have to do, and police officers are problem solvers. You call them because you have a problem and you want it fixed. No one wants to call the police and have the officer show up and the officer say, I can't help you. Because what's the next thing you say? Well, why did I call you? What do we have you for? I pay your salary, right? You're no good to me. Bring back somebody who can help me, right? So officers really use the law to solve problems on a moment by moment basis, right? I can tell you that when you call the police, especially if you're reporting some sort of minor crime, right? Truth be told, you know, if it's a really minor crime and the officers drive through the area and we don't really see who caused the problem, we got something else waiting for us that is probably more serious, and we just keep moving on, right? But if you're a guy that, man, people complain about you every day you're out here, you know, causing problems, and in this community we have that, you know, there's folks that will call and, you know, just doing outrageous stuff. You're peeing in the storefront of the business out here, and, you know, all those, you know, that's a person who people are just kind of fed up. They're like, we call every day on this guy and you guys don't do anything. Officers catch that individual doing some little minor thing, enforcement might be appropriate for that individual, and that person gets taken away. That's kind of how that works.
What about homeless people?
What about homeless people?
I know, I mean, I went to like, I've been told many times by people that are homeless that because of the laws that give the officer the ability to arrest or take away the individual to the possessions of a homeless person, they have the liberty to do it. And the truth be told, the people that live in the building outside of where the homeless person has to live are calling to complain about it. So as a police officer, how do you balance maybe what you personally feel is the right way to approach the situation versus what the law says? Because clearly people have been complaining about this person sleeping and pissing and living right outside of their apartment building for 2 weeks at a time or whatever.
I mean, the homeless issue is super complex.
Right. You know, that is a super complex issue, homelessness, and I will tell you that it is not unique to San Diego. All right, homelessness has a lot of things that, you know, I don't think people just decide to be homeless. I think things go on in people's lives that put them in situations where they wind up not being able to cope, and you know, I think everybody at the end of the day just wants to live, right? But for whatever reason, you know, there are individuals that don't have a house to live in, right? And one of the things I used to tell my young officers, right, because we do have to have some compassion, and I'm not saying that you don't enforce on homeless people, right? Because everything is done on a case-by-case basis. But I'm saying you have some compassion. And one of the things that I would tell them is that how many paychecks, everybody think about this. If you know, you work, right? How many paychecks could you go before you were homeless, right? And when you really start thinking about how many pay periods, most people get paid either every 2 weeks or every month, right? You got some credit cards, right? That sort of thing. But what happens when you max your visa, right? And you got no more income coming in? How long is that? For some people, a couple months, unemployment. You get unemployment, that runs out eventually, right? It's not as long as you think, right? And that was a lesson I would give to young officers, that, you know, how many paychecks could you miss before you could be living like this, right? When you really frame it in perspective like that for officers, it does kind of help guide their decision making, right? There are some folks that, man, they are just obnoxious and they cause a lot of problems, and you know, people are calling on them because it's an issue, right? You can't. Police officers are kind of the referees of society, right? They show up, there's some sort of problem, and they have to somehow sort it out. And they got a rule book, right, that's got a whole bunch of rules in it, and they look to find the rule or two or three or more that they could apply to this situation to solve this problem today. They don't like to come out to a situation and say they can't do anything, because they take the job because they want to help people and they want to do the right thing, right? But there are some situations that are out of their hands. I think the homeless situation may be so complex that it's going to require a lot more than people with a badge to solve those
Absolutely.
issues.
It's like a city planning issue. Before I call on you, there was someone who back there had a question a while ago.
So you said you discussed a lot of things in your amongst you guys. You guys discussed that maybe media influence you? Like, is that discussed amongst you guys? Like maybe you know how media portrays black people as just this kind of look. It's not a good look, but it's a bad look. And you go to this incident and you see a black person. Does that influence you? Have you guys like discuss that? I hear you discuss a lot of people. Do you discuss that?
We absolutely. Not only that, but not only we discuss it that way, but we discuss it the other way also. That how the media makes law enforcement look. Most law enforcement officers don't believe that the media makes them look very good. One of the things that we will notice, police officers every day, they respond to hundreds of calls. I think San Diego gets like, you know, I don't know, 1.5 million calls or something like that a year, right? And believe it or not, most of those calls wind up in officers taking very minimal action, and people are satisfied and people are happy and the officers go on about their business, and you don't hear about that, right? You don't hear about that. You do hear about that one call, right, where the officer showed up and something bad happened. There was force used, or someone was shot, or that's the one that suddenly gets all the press, all the media. It's someone on Facebook Live that suddenly jumps in, and here you are, you know, and they're showing, you know, an officer taking action, but they don't show you what happened before that, right? You get part of a story, right? And a lot of times the officers are really portrayed in a negative light, right? And that is harmful to officers, to their psyche. It's part of what has really put us in this position where a lot of people don't want to be police officers today, right? There's a lot of negative media, man. People, you know, at least some people in society don't like police officers. My father being one of them, right? He likes me, right? But I don't know if he likes some of my friends. He may not like you, right? He probably will if I said you're okay, though. If I said you're okay, he'll probably think you're all right.
We like you, it's cool.
Yeah. And dealing with those people, right, is very difficult for officers, because the one thing that police officers do very well is they learn from experience. And your experience is, if I show up and do something a certain way and I get a certain outcome, the likelihood in my mind is that if I have a similar set of circumstances, that I can take that same action and things will wind up the same way. And that's kind of how officers do things. It becomes, for lack of a better term, because we hate to use this word, but it becomes routine, right? And that's one of the things they teach us in Police Academy, that nothing is routine, and don't think that way, but we're human, we do, right? So you learn to systemize your thoughts, you systemize how you handle calls. I know that if I go to a domestic dispute call, right, this is how they taught me to do it in the academy. It doesn't always specifically work that way. I gotta do things a little bit different on the street, but I'm probably gonna follow the same procedural steps, right? And when I say procedure, I don't mean procedure by policies in the book. I mean, I'm gonna take the same course of action, typically, unless some variable comes into play where I have to change, right? I'm usually gonna do the same thing. And that comes out when you're dealing with someone and someone is very belligerent and hostile, and you know, officers are human, right? And we recruit people from the human race, right? So everything that everyone else has in their family, police officers have in their families too, right? They got bills to pay, right? Some of them don't pay their credit cards on time. They get a car repossessed. Everything that happens, somebody in their family is got some mental issues, and you know, somebody in their family died, or somebody you know, is an alcoholic. Could be them. You know, I mean, officers are just people, right? The identity is formed when suddenly you put this uniform on, and that's when there's some expectations that society applies now to that person in that uniform that maybe sometimes is unrealistic, right? I think the greater society should expect law enforcement officers to deliver service, right? They should be professional, right? They should be competent at what their jobs are, right? But they're human. They get affected by things, and they learn through police culture, right, to really bury some of those things and not show emotion and not be visibly shaken by things that are horrifying to the general public, right? Absolutely horrifying. They get called to the worst situations. You see things on TV, it is nothing like seeing it in real life, because when you see it in real life, you experience all the senses with it, right? There's one thing to see a picture of someone being stabbed, but then it's another thing to be there and to see the person being stabbed and to see the blood and smell it, the smells and the sounds and all. They experience trauma, right? And most of the time, if you've ever seen officers at an accident or scene or something like that, they really kind of go into autopilot, right? And do what they've been trained to do, and they really hide the trauma until they're somewhere else by themselves, or back at the station, or they're on their way home. Some of it comes out at home, all right? My daughters are here, and I used to tell them this story, but they didn't understand it. Dad is just mean, all right? When I was a brand new officer, I was 23 years old, and in Southeast San Diego, Christmas Eve, all right, there was a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old together coming out of an alleyway, all right, off of Hemlock Street. I remember it vividly like it was yesterday. And one of the boys was riding on a skateboard, and his brother was running, and they had just went to a neighborhood liquor store, right? And in some neighborhoods, including this one, liquor stores are just houses that they sell liquor in. I don't know how that happens, but they had gone there and they bought candy, because kids in that neighborhood, that's where they go. They didn't have Vons. There wasn't no 7-Eleven over off of 38 Hemlock, you know, Circle K. You know, they had, you know, Pete's Market or whatever it was called, right? and they bought some candy, and they were running, they were having fun, and they ran out of the alley. And just as they ran out of the alley, remember, cars are parked on the street. They ran out of the alley on the skateboard and got hit by a car. And the car dragged those two boys down the street. The older boy suffered a broken leg, but the 7-year-old, actually he was 5, he got dragged about, 100 feet down the road or more before the driver realized to stop the car. And when he stopped the car, that kid was trapped up under the car, right, in the wheel well, right? And I was a trainee, all right? And training officers, brand new officers, those are the types of calls you get. Why do they give you that call as a brand new officer? So that you learn how to handle it and you experience. And then, my FTO, right, it's how I handled it, right? But I remember very vividly seeing the skateboard on the street and the candy scattered about, and this is very vivid here, so viewer discretion advised. I saw the scuffed skin trailed down the street, right, and hair and all those things. And I had never seen something like that. The first, in one of my phases, I saw a motorcyclist over by San Diego State lose a foot, but that wasn't the same, right? And I saw this little boy, basically he's trapped under this car, and the community was enraged, right? People were upset, naturally so, all right? They wanted to know if the guy was drunk driving. It wasn't any of that. The people who caused the accident were actually the little boys, right? And the man couldn't see them, because when you park your car a certain way, and when I back out of my driveway, if a car is parked close enough to my driveway, I'm blind, I can't really see around it. And he had the right of way going down the street. These boys just darted out in front of him, and he hit him, right? And with reaction time and all those other sorts of things, it took a while for that car to stop. And I remember it took a long time to get the car off the boy, because you had to call out special stuff to come take care of it. And I remember the boy's parents showed up, and his mom was screaming and wailing, and I'm talking about both her boys are hurt and one's dead, right? And that was the first time I heard this mother. And you can only imagine what the wails of this mother was like. And remember, I'm only 23 years old, right? It's horrific to me, right? The father had a heart attack. They're at the scene. So now we got the two boys down. One's in an ambulance. He's been shipped to Children's Hospital. I gotta call another ambulance for the father who just had a heart attack. The news is there. It's just chaotic. It's crazy, right? But I knew what caused the accident. And to me, what caused the accident was the skateboard. I blamed it on the skateboard. And what did I do? What did I do? I took their skateboard away. And they're so mad at me that I took their skateboard away, right? But I couldn't tell I think, well, they were probably like 5 and 7 or something like that. I couldn't tell my daughters, well, Daddy's been at work today and he saw 2 little boys run over by a car, and one was killed and they were on a skateboard, and I don't want to see you run over by a car, right? Because in my mind, that's what I saw, right? And I took their skateboard away. In fact, I angrily took their skateboard away and broke it and all that other kind of stuff, because I was experiencing that trauma. It was playing out in me, right? I couldn't deal with it there because I had a job to do. And that pent up in me that, ooh, I have 2 little kids too, and they ride on skateboards, and this could happen to them. These parents didn't think when they gave their kids a skateboard that, they were gonna lose one. And it was Christmas Eve at that, right? So all of that weighed in. So, what I'm trying to tell you is that officers are just people, right? And we have to remember that. It's not an excuse for officers when they do wrong, and officers do wrong, right? We admit that. There's processes for dealing with officers that do wrong, right? But they're people, right? And we have to remember, maybe sometimes we have to lower our expectations of people and let people be human, right?
Yeah.
I know you probably didn't want to hear all that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
I'm sorry.
No, don't.
I've been
sorry,
carrying that
was-
around for 28 years.
No, we need to-
That was a story that was the first impactful story of my career, right? That made me think about whether or not, and lots of them came after that, but ooh, is this the type of job I want to have? You know, because if I didn't have this job, I don't think I would have saw that. And I got lots of those, ooh, if I never had to see that, I'd be okay.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
No, really, don't say sorry. That was. Thank you. We had a question somewhere.
Well, okay, just like earlier, I can understand what you're saying. You know, like I said, when I talked to you earlier, my father was a police officer too. Plus he was in the Navy. I don't try to sugarcoat nothing, you know, because it's really bad in everyone. Only thing I don't like about the police still right now today is, like I said, they just had that meeting over at Cherokee. Who was that designed for was the chokehold? When they came up with the chokehold, what color was that really designed for?
I wasn't at that meeting, so I'm not sure what. I think you're talking about the carotid restraint. And I do know that there was a meeting at Cherokee Point with the Citizen Review Board, or Civilian Review Board, Community Review Board, whatever it's called. The carotid restraint it's based on a martial arts technique that is designed to use bilateral constriction of the carotid sheaths to temporarily stop blood flow to the brain to render an individual unconscious. Applied appropriately, it is effective. However, with anything, nothing's absolute, right? I'm unaware of it being designed or put into effect as a policy because race was a factor or skin color was a factor in it. It's just a technique that officers use by policy in their use of force policy to.
Deadly force, though.
Well, it all depends on the department's use of force matrix and use of force continuum, and the San Diego Police Department does not classify the carotid restraint as deadly force. Is it a technique that used improperly could cause death? Yes. It's also a technique that any technique, even used properly, could cause death depending on the individual, but it is not classified as deadly force by the San Diego Police Department.
Why not?
I don't know. That part I don't know. I'm not on the use of force committee. I do know that in my experience as a martial arts instructor, I have taught my students how to use those holds. I think jiu-jitsu is a martial